So I want to apologize in advance. I have a cold, so I will not shake your hands or be too close to you. And I hope that I don't have a coughing fit. I have every tool I need to prevent that. So I want to thank you guys for having me here. We've been planning this for, gosh, almost a year until our schedules lined up. So I'm happy to be here. And as Micah said, I'm a professor at the university, but I spend most of my time in the field. So today I was in a preschool. Yesterday I was in an elementary school. Where I got this cold was a high school in another part of the state. Eastern Montana has different germs than we do, so I don't have antibodies for that. And I like having that field experience because I get pretty done pretty quickly if I don't see what's really happening with the kids. And so even though my area of interest is autism, the reason why I get called to be in the field isn't because kids have autism, it's because they have challenging behaviors. So not all kids with autism have challenging behaviors, but enough kids do that that's what I spend a lot of my time doing. Also in Montana, we take every specialist and make them a generalist, and take every generalist and make them a specialist. So when I came to Montana, I studied only early childhood kids with autism. And now I've done the whole spectrum and the whole age spectrum, including going to the prison once a month to serve some kids there. So I get to see a wide variety of stuff. So I'm super happy to get to talk to you guys today. You're a group I've never talked to, and so that's pretty exciting. We're going to go 55 minutes, I was told, and then wait for the people that can stick it out. We have some raffle prizes, a good reinforcement. So I want to get kind of a sense about what you guys are interested in terms of kids with autism today. So I want to do about a 5-minute icebreaker, and then I'll actually align my talk in accordance with what we come up with the icebreaker. The other thing is I talk pretty fast, so I might not talk as fast with my cold. So if your ears don't listen as fast as my mouth talks, just let me know and I'll slow down. The other thing is I'm a pretty laid back presenter, so if I said something that doesn't make sense to you, go ahead and stop me and I'll explain it another way. Also, if I use examples, and let's say I use an example for young kids, but you're interested about how it would affect an older kid, just let me know and I'll try to pull out another example to illustrate that. Does that make sense to everybody? Is that a good deal? All right, so the icebreaker I want to do is called Myths, Facts, and Questions. So myths are what? Things we think are true but aren't. Facts are truth, unless it says alternative, and those are really myths. And then questions are just things you want to know. So again, the focus is kids with autism. So what are some myths you might know about kids with autism? What are some questions you might have? And what are some facts you know? Go ahead, and my handwriting's not that good, but my mom said my handwriting got really bad when I became a doctor. So what can I tell you? So anybody know some myths or facts or have some questions? Go ahead.
I guess, I keep running into the diagnosis of autism when I see kids struggling with social skills. And so I almost start to feel like those two are lining up in people's heads, and I don't know if that fits or not. Or
so
can a kid just have social skills problems without actually being on?
So that's your question.
Yes.
Can there be social skills deficits without an ASD-DX? How's that? Okay, yeah.
This is something that I'm a special educator in school districts, but this is something that often confuses people. That a medical autism diagnosis does not automatically qualify kids for educational IEP services with autism.
Myth, fact, or question?
That would be a fact.
Okay.
Just so I know. It might be a clarifying fact that some people don't realize.
So I wrote medical diagnosis and IDEA funding categories are not the same. Where did you say you teach?
I teach at Cold Springs School here.
Cold Springs? Good deal. All right, yeah.
I I was told, and I don't know if it's fact or myth, that
So-
children with autism only see in black and white and they can't pretend.
Okay, so let's write that as a question, since we don't know if it's a fact or myth. Yeah,
So our son doesn't understand personal boundaries.
okay, so is that a fact or a,
In fact, in our house.
okay.
So I have a fact, the diagnostic criteria for autism has expanded for a lot in the last, I don't know, century.
Okay. So I want to make sure we have probably 4 more questions and as many more myths and facts as we can come up with in that time period. Yeah.
I heard just this week that the symptoms of autism in girls could be a lot different than boys.
The
I was
symptoms.
just wondering what, I mean, I heard that they
Okay.
use mimicry more or something. I don't know much about it. Like I just heard some of it.
Okay.
I'm wondering how it looks different in girls than boys.
Don't all jump in at once. I know those brownies are laying heavy now.
Children with autism get misdiagnosed all the time because of their behavior because of regular behavior problems.
Okay, so you stated that like a fact. Is that where you want me to put it?
I knew nothing about autism, and then I had 2 students in high school chemistry. I taught chemistry that were autistic, and I guess my myth was that kids with autism would struggle in a mainstream classroom.
Okay.
They didn't, and I was surprised. So, I mean, they did great. That was sort of my myth, I guess.
Yeah.
It's a myth that children with autism don't grow up to be normal. I think it's a myth.
Somebody else had a hand up in this direction. So when I teach at the university, what I always tell them is I'm a little bit like an auctioneer, so if you like move the wrong way. All right, one more question for sure. Because if you guys don't have that many questions, we can go right to the raffle.
I actually don't even know what autism is.
Okay.
So.
How many are with her? Don't leave her hanging. That was a brave question, okay.
I think maybe along with that, like autism is the new ADD, like kind of an overdiagnosed hip category. I don't know if hip's the right term, but
I'm gonna put hip. I like that. Yeah.
Is the prevalence of autism diagnosis equal among different cultures and countries?
Okay, any last, yeah, in the
How
back.
do you know if a child has autism?
How do you know? Oh yeah, now we're on a roll, yeah.
I don't know where this goes, but diet affects autism response.
Alright, I'm gonna put that with a question since we don't know where it goes. And there was one more right here, and then I'll get you. Go
Are
ahead.
children born with autism?
Now I need more paper. Yeah, where was
Do they
that?
suffer a higher level of anxiety?
So I didn't hear the first part.
Do they suffer a higher level of anxiety?
Alright, last, yeah.
Do vaccinations cause autism? Is that
Well, we don't have 10 hours. Do they allow beer here? No, well, I'll address that since you asked it. All right, any other burning questions? All right, so I want to start, it looks like we have a couple different themes. So one is kind of what's autism and how is it diagnosed, what are the characteristics? And then you guys didn't ask too much about intervention, but some of the facts and myths kind of talk about that. So I'll talk a little bit about intervention too, in terms of things that I think need to be in place. And I was thinking the third thing you guys might be interested in is local resources. Is that an issue for you guys, or do you feel like you are well connected?
I think it has shifted, so if you would talk about it, it would be helpful.
Okay, so I'll try to fit that in at the end. So, okay. I have everything in my pocket I need for talking in a cold, so I'll probably lose something. You're like, where are my markers? Like when you have put your sunglasses on your head. Okay, so I want to talk about the diagnosis of autism, not because I think you guys need to know how to diagnose it, but because it will give you a sense about what the disability is and help you know those kind of red flags. So if you ever have kids that kind of meet that criteria, you would have something to take to the physician or other folks that diagnose. So the word autism is actually a word. It has its own meaning. Has anybody ever heard of the word autism? Beyond autism spectrum disorders? Okay, so what does the word auto mean? Not in mobile, but like biography, autobiography. What's auto mean? Self. So the word autism actually means into self. And the first time that word was ever seen in the English language was in 1912. So in the 1940s, there was a guy named Leo, people pronounce it differently, Kanner or Connor, K-N-N-E-R, in Baltimore, who described in a psychological journal kids that he called autistic because they appeared to him to be into themselves. Okay, so he saw them kind of not being social, maybe engaging in some self-stimulatory behavior, things like that. At the same time in Europe, same dates, a guy named Leo Asperger also described a similar population, but he named it after himself, Asperger's syndrome. Now, he was a German Jew, so you know what happened during that time to that population, so his work was actually buried and not continued. All right, so it wasn't actually until about the 1980s that in this country we started diagnosing autism. And then from the 1980s till about the 2000s, the diagnostic criteria did change and expand over time, but not that much. And what happened in this time period was, we're going to talk about the medical diagnosis here. In the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is the gold standard for psychological disorders, there was an umbrella term called Pervasive Developmental Disorders. So what's the word pervasive mean? Spread all over, lots of. Developmental, anybody have a quick definition of developmental? Yeah, so whenever I ask teachers that, they all go like this, because they know they should know it, but they don't want to say. So my kind of quick and ready definition of development is the things we learn without direct teaching. So across all areas of things we learn, disorder. So what does the word disorder mean? Dis means what? Out of, right? Out of order. Out of order of what? Normal development. So this umbrella term was across all areas of development were out of order. And there were 5 different disease categories in this. Autism, Asperger's, PDD, just from these letters, NOS, not otherwise specified. Then something called CDD, and something called Rett, named after Dr. Rett. So what happened was all of these have slightly different diagnostic criteria. CDD, childhood dysregulative disorder, is something I've never worked with, and I am thankful for that. It's very rare. The disorder is characterized by typical development until the age of 5. Then kids lose their skills and have an average life expectancy of 11 years of age. So we're glad that's super rare. Rett's syndrome is more common in girls than in boys, and it's characterized by some classic hand-wringing. Girls with Rett syndrome have a shortened lifespan. They live till their early 20s generally, often nonverbal, often non-ambulatory. They don't often walk. There is a regional expert named Dr. Dino in Rett syndrome, and she's at the University of Washington. So if you're ever wanting a definitive diagnosis, the University's Center on Disability there has a woman who can do a definitive diagnosis. Those two are always thought of as a little bit separate. So we had autism, Asperger's, and PDD-NOS. So in this time period, remember we're doing a little bit of a history lesson. See, I'm already looking for these pens. And look, a tissue, sorry. It hasn't been, this one has not been used. There were 3 areas of deficit. So we called it a triad of deficit. One was in social skills, one in communication skills, and one what we called a restricted repertoire. Okay, so you guys you know a lot about kids, right? So you can kind of imagine, oh, he has difficulties with social skills. That makes sense if we went down to Albertsons and caught people as they came in. You know, do you understand lack of social skills? People are going to have a general idea. Not a precise idea, but a general idea. Same thing if we say, oh, he has a problem communicating. People are going to have a general idea. But most people don't really know what we need by restricted repertoire. So restricted repertoire actually has 2 parts to it. So the first part is what we would call repetitive behavior. So that's some rocking, some flapping, maybe some hand biting, head banging, eye gouging, things like that. The second part of it is actually just being interested in fewer things. So that's everything from a kid only being interested in the wheels of their toy car to only being interested in one particular topic. So my husband's on a plane to New York City to visit our daughter right now, but if he was here, he could tell you everything you wanted to know about baseball because he's a Cleveland Indians fan, grew up south of Cleveland, and if you know anything about, I was going to call it football, baseball, he could tell you all about it because he knows about things before he was alive, like, you know, the roster of whatever team or whatever. But it's not a restricted repertoire because, like a lot of people in Montana, if you get him talking about fly fishing, he'll talk a lot about that. And football's coming up, so, or is technically here. Not good for the Browns, so we're focusing on the Indians. But he could talk about that too. So even though he has depth of knowledge that he likes to talk about, it's not a restricted repertoire because you can move him off of it and he doesn't need to go back to it. So think about 2-year-olds who are into dinosaurs and that's all they want. That's sort of like restricted repertoire, but that's part of the developmental strain. For kids with autism, they don't like to move off of it. Right? And when I talk to parents of older kids with autism, they'll say, oh, they always had a significant interest, but it changed over time. Like it was dinosaurs, and then it was the Civil War, and then it was flags. I work with a kid who can draw every flag from every nation by memory. And if he doesn't have anything to do, or you want him to do something he doesn't like, he draws flags. I worked with a little girl with autism. She was a kindergartner, and she loved flowers. And this was in Seattle. We were walking in a neighborhood, and I was like, there's a flower, there's a flower, there's a flower. And then I said, and she was interested, we were having a conversation. Then I said, there's a rose. And she doesn't respond. And any of you guys Shakespeare buffs here? Because then I said, there's a flower. Why aren't you interested? She said, a rose is a rose, but a flower is a flower. That's the Shakespeare joke, though. So if we don't know Shakespeare, that's fine. But my point is that because I gave it another label, she lost interest. I had to go back to talking just about flowers. So sometimes these interests can be helpful. I worked with a 5-year-old boy, and he liked birds so much that he could literally read college textbooks about birds, not about any other subject. So sometimes that depth of information is important, but when you can't leave it, it makes it hard to make friends, to fit into school, and other things like that. Okay, so all three of these, autism, Asperger's, and PDD-NOS, have these 3 deficit areas. So what's the difference? Well, at the time, there were 8 different indicators of communication deficits. And if you met 6 or more, you would meet the criteria for autism. But what happens if you met 5? You wouldn't be really quote-unquote normal, but you wouldn't meet the criteria either. That's the kids that got PDD-NOS diagnosis. Now, we just talked about this word, disorder. So, in my world, in special education, we talk about disorders and delays. So kids with Down syndrome have developmental delays. Kids with autism have developmental disorders. So are those the same thing? Do you think we just gave them different words to be tricky? Because the teachers in the field will tell you that we have more different acronyms than we should. So is that the case, we just gave it another name? Or do you think they might be different?
They would be opposite. A delay would just mean that it takes them longer to learn. Disorder, I would assume, means they won't learn it.
Okay, so I agree with the first half. So delay definitely means it takes longer to learn. Okay, but the underlying idea there is they're still learning the same steps in the same order as typically developing kids. Okay? Disorder means we're learning out of order. So not necessarily that they won't learn. It's that they learn out of order. So let me give you a crash course in language development. Anybody a speech-language pathologist in the room? Okay, then I'll go really fast here. This is the Cliff Notes version. I never know when my metaphors are going to run out. Like, do millennials know Cliff Notes? I don't know. They just have Google, right? My husband calls it the Google. Like, his dad calls cancer the cancer. So now we have the Google. He's a sweet man. So, for typically developing kids, they're born and they make vowel sounds. Ah, E. Then they make what we call canonical vocalizations, which is fancy for saying vowel, consonant vowel combinations. Mama, dada, baba. Then those become words. Mommy, daddy, bottle. Then we add words. So want bottle, want mommy, and then it's more words. Want big bottle. And then we add words until we get to about 5-word sentences, and that's when things like irony and humor tend to come in. Okay, so that's how you learn language. There, you don't even need a master's degree for that. Kids, sorry, I got so excited. Kids with Down syndrome who have a delay learn exactly the same way, but it takes them longer. They have a big tongue, small mouth, hard to make the letters, but they learn E, mama, mom, ba, da, mommy, daddy, bottle, want bottle, etc. Kids with autism who go through that same structure tend to have better outcomes. But most kids with autism go A-E, and they skip canonical vocalizations, and then they may repeat words or not talk at all. So I worked with a kid named Cody, and when you said, "Hi, Cody," to him, he said, "Hi, Cody." So we would think 2 words, you should be 2 years of age. You should have gone through vowel sounds, vowel consonant sounds, words, and 2 words, right? Like whatever that is, the 5th stage. The problem is he didn't know what hi meant, and he didn't know he was Cody. So here's the problem. If we teach him where he is, 2-word utterances, we would be teaching 3-word utterances. That's not a good idea in this case. We have to teach backwards to teach him what hi means and what Cody means before he can put it together. So he understands each, what we would call token or meaningful part of language. But here's the even trickier part. We don't always go back and fill in the holes. So there's some kids who never crawl. They go from scooting to walking. I would never tell a walker, "Go crawl." So this makes it really hard for parents and teachers to know, what's this kid need to know next? Because it's in a disorder, so we can't use typical development to help us plan. And if we take Cody at hi, Cody is his developmental level, then we're going to frustrate him because the rest of his skills aren't that high. Does that make sense? All right, I'm on fast forward here. So the big difference between autism and Asperger's are that at Asperger's you didn't have a delay until the onset of speech. So technically speaking, you could have never gotten really smart with autism and become Asperger's, even though sometimes it was used that way. So in the 2000s, specifically 2013, the DSM had a big revision, and it took CDD out and RETS out. They went to another part of the DSM. They combined all of this into one disability called autism spectrum disorders. They created a new disability called social communication disability, and they took social communication and put them together as one deficit area and kept the restricted repertoire. Okay, so people thought that was going to decrease the number of kids with autism. We've had studies since 2013 that show that it actually stayed about the same with that big change. So between 2000 and 2013, the medical diagnosis and the IDEA, or special ed funding, and the World Health Organization actually all had the same definitions, which was hugely helpful. Now we don't. The DSM has a different one, IDEA has a different one, World Health has a different one. Totally confusing. Sorry. That sounded kind of like false. So sorry, but it's not my choice. All right, so there's something that we don't see here in any of these definitions. In some skill that it doesn't matter for the diagnosis. Does it jump out to anybody? IQ. IQ is not part of the definition of autism. So when we think of spectrum, autism within self-spectrum across the range, again, disorder, part of the spectrum is how IQ fits disability. So there's an argument about whether kids with developmental delays, whether that's part of autism proper, or if that's a comorbidity or something that co-occurs with autism. It used to be 80% of the population had cognitive delay. Now it's about 50% because we've gotten better at diagnosing the higher end of the population. The other thing I want to say here is if somebody is diagnosed with Asperger's, even though it no longer exists, you can still refer to yourself as having Asperger's. We're not going to tell you not to. But technically that doesn't exist. Okay, so autism. Anybody know the current rate of autism according to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta? 1 in 68. So I've been in the field 30 years, close, 25 years. And when I started, the incidence rate was 1 in 10,000 live births, and now it's 1 in 68. The good news here is that in 2013 and in 2015, the CDC's released a report. They release a report every 2 years telling us how many kids have autism. It was the first time the number didn't change in a long time. All right, so then we get the question, are there more kids? Are more kids being diagnosed? And the answer is we don't really know. We also don't know the cause, so we have this vaccine issue. So there is no known cause of having kids with autism. There's no scientific proof that vaccines at all contribute to autism. Okay, so the reason the vaccine story came out is because this no longer accredited doctor in England announced that that was the link, that he saw a link, and he published a paper like that. So that paper's since been removed. His co-authors have disbanded it, but in the same time, who's that woman that takes off her clothes for Playboy? She's an actress. What? Jenny McCarthy kind of has become this guy's best friend and has led a lot of marches and stuff and raised a lot of funds saying we think that autism, that there's problems with the vaccines. Okay, so we know if we can't tell you exactly what causes something, you're going to want to guess, right? But there's been studies across multiple countries, twin studies, there's been changes in the vaccines, and none of that has affected the autism rate. I will tell you this, I wish it did. Why would I say that? Because then we could stop it, fix it. Otherwise, autism is a lifelong developmental disability and kids do not grow out of it. Autism has the worst long-term outcomes of any developmental disability there is. Under 20% of adults with autism have any kind of employment, including volunteer and part-time opportunities. Only about 3% of people with autism live outside their parents' home. Okay, when we look at measures of outcome for life, we look at self-reported happiness, relationships, and economic freedom or jobs. And they're all, people with autism rate all of those aspects low, even our high-functioning folks. In fact, our high-functioning folks get very frustrated that they can't establish and maintain relationships or jobs because they're cognitively intact. They understand that they can't do the water cooler talk or don't know how to ask somebody for a date or not how to talk about themselves. And they want that, but they don't have the skills and support to be able to get that. So that's one of the things that really concerns me, having worked with adults here in Montana. So autism is an equal opportunity disability. Just because you have autism doesn't mean you won't have anything else. The hardest kids I work with have autism and Down syndrome. We see lots of kids with autism and ADHD. We see kids with autism and specific language impairment. We see kids with autism and social anxiety. 72% of the population has depression. 73% of the population has obesity. So there's tons of what we call comorbidities, or things that happen alongside. OCD, I already talked about social anxiety. Other language stuff, all of those things can co-occur. In fact, one disability called Fragile X syndrome, 30 to 40% of those kids also have autism. And that's actually one of the reasons why we think the best guess for cause of autism at this point is genetics and something else. Okay, so here's the case for genetics and sort of against vaccines, is that in identical twins, so the rate of autism is 1 in 68, right? So you have a little less than a 2% chance, given a fair roll, of having autism. If you have a sibling, a non-twin sibling with autism, your chance of having autism goes up to 20%. If you have an identical twin with autism, you have a 90% chance of having autism. Now, if autism was genes only, what would be the percentage of identical twins having autism? 100%. It's not 100%, it's 90%. So we think something's happening at conception or during the pregnancy, before birth, that's creating autism. We know there's over 200 genes associated with autism, but this is a complex disability. We know that there's some genes that mom and dad don't carry that seem to get turned on in utero that then cause autism. So that's not a, like, remember when you studied about Mendel and the P's or your eye color and it was like a recessive and a dominant? This is a different, I shouldn't be talking about science with the science teacher, but this is a different kind of hereditary argument, okay? The other arguments for a genetic aspect to autism is we have rodent models. Mice, they make mice and rats with autism, which I never thought you could do because I didn't know that they could talk, but they have made these nice models. And we now have factors for a good model for at risk. Not at risk like Head Start, at risk for autism. So there's a few characteristics for at risk for autism. One's having an older father. What's an older father? Over 45. One's having premature birth and low birth weight, a smoking mom. Those things, everything but the dad, is all associated with any kind of developmental disability, not just autism. Advanced maternal age is not a predictor at all. Advanced maternal age is 35. It doesn't seem to matter, but the number of fertility treatments does. Okay, but the biggest predictor of having autism is being a sibling with autism.
Does it still affect more males?
Yeah, absolutely. So
that would be a case, I guess, against vaccines too, because
right, you would want an even distribution. Yeah, so boys are 5 times more likely than girls to have autism. We are not sure why, but it is part of that argument. So girls with autism are a little bit different. They tend to be more introverted, and they tend to be either very low on the spectrum or very high on the spectrum. We don't tend to see the whole spectrum like we do with boys. So there's some differences, but more similarities than differences. Okay, this doesn't affect race, class, ethnicity, anything like that. But I'll tell you, here in Montana, we diagnose Native Americans at 50% of the rate that we do our white population. That means we're not doing a good cultural outreach to help that population access services, and the earlier kids get services, the better the outcomes. So that's one of my personal missions, is to try to decrease that. Sorry, I just got scared about the time. The symptoms have to be present before the age of 3, but not diagnosed. So it is something that happens in early childhood. In most cases, we think that kids are born with it and develop differently. In some cases, and there's video evidence, because of course everybody has a phone videotaping everything, it looks like some kids hit some mile markers until about the age of 2 and then lose skills. And that's one of the reasons why the vaccines get some juice, is because some people associate that loss of skill and that timing with the onset of vaccines. But like I said, there's no evidence whatsoever that shows a connection. And so the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention will not say no, it doesn't cause it, because in science you can't say that. They just say there's no known evidence, and there's evidence to the contrary. Okay. Do children with autism get misdiagnosed because of behavior, or is it the new ADHD? So I would say that kids with autism get misdiagnosed for lots of reasons. One thing we say about diagnosing kids with autism is, if you've worked with one kid with autism, you've worked with one kid with autism. Because of that spectrum nature, they're all different, right? There's some underlying characteristics that are similar, but there could be a kid who is highly verbal, highly intelligent, and have a correct diagnosis of autism, and then there could be a kid who has a severe cognitive delay, totally socially avoidant, non-talking, and with a significant cognitive delay. And they can both be correctly diagnosed with autism. Some early indications of having autism: not responding to your name as frequently as other kids. So do you know when you see somebody that you know, your face brightens? You guys know that deal? It's called facial brightening. So kids with autism don't do any facial brightening. So if they see mom or dad or somebody else they have a relationship with, they don't show that knowledge. They don't tend to engage in what we call initiating joint attention. So joint attention is when you see the airplane in the sky and the toddler goes, ah, and then looks at mom or dad to get the label for that airplane. It's joint because I'm looking at a person, attention, or paying attention to something like that. Kids with autism don't initiate joint attention at the same rates as typically developing kids. Kids with autism, these are young kids talking about diagnosis, don't point. So I worked with one mom and she said, I want you to teach my son to point. I'm like, okay, but like this was a kid that didn't talk. I mean, this kid had so many deficits that not pointing was part of his deficit, but I would argue probably not his most important deficit. So I had a long talk with her, and she said, they told me where they diagnosed him that he was autistic because he didn't point. So if you teach him to point, he won't be autistic. And so we had to talk about how it didn't work that way. But they don't tend to, what we do say is proto-declarative point. So again, bringing that social attention in. And so they don't respond to their name, don't do proto-declarative pointing, don't do joint attention. Those are the main young characteristics, okay? So, and they don't imitate. So motor imitation is doing what somebody else does. So how old are kids, typically developing kids, when they learn to imitate? Anybody know? So 45 minutes old is the first test we have. And so people don't really test any younger than that because you have to have your APGARs and get cleaned up. But some moms actually let babies be tested for imitation. And this guy named Andy Meltzoff at the University of Washington found this out. And so just born babies, he calls them the best babies, natural childbirth, full-term babies. He tested at 45 minutes old and they can do a finger splay. They can do an ooh face, and they can do it has a technical name, a tongue thrust. It's a pretty fun party game. Kids with autism, without being taught to imitate, don't imitate until they're 9 to 11 years of age. Imitation is important because it's a learn-to-learn strategy. In any room of teachers, if I say, how are you going to teach the kid? They say, I'm going to tell him. Strike one. What happens if you can't tell them? I'm going to show them. That's imitation. Strike two. Strike three is that we're teaching outside of their restricted repertoire. So going to school is a challenge for kids with autism. They walk in with 3 strikes. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So kids with autism don't learn to imitate. Now, if we show them a robot making an action that we've seen them make, they can imitate it. So what's the key point there? They don't imitate people, but they'll imitate the robot. That to me shows how much that social interaction is compromising their skill set. Okay? And it is the social skills that prevent those long-term outcomes. If you can't do water cooler talk or whatever we call it today, like I don't do any social media, so whatever, Snapchat, Facebook, whatever that people do, if you don't do that, you're not keeping your job, right? If you can't get along at the office, doesn't matter how good your skills are, you're not being hired. You're not retaining employment. Does that make sense? So one of the primary things when we move to treatment, we think about providing intervention for kids with autism, that social skills becomes important. It becomes important for jobs. It becomes important for satisfaction. And here, I'm writing a book on this. I'm on sabbatical. Don't get jealous. I'm going to live in Hawaii for 6 months starting on November 3rd. And I'm writing a book, and I'm working there. So it's not like it's all fun and games. But I'm writing a book on motivation in kids with autism. Turns out that social interaction is a linchpin or a key part to higher level motivation. So if you don't have that sense of belonging, then you're missing how to get motivation for higher level skills. We can teach with some kind of reinforcer a basic skill. We can't teach higher level cooperative, creative task participation. with anything other than social belonging. So that social part of autism is important. But to Tim's point, there are other disabilities where social skills are impaired. So not every kid that's shy, not every kid that's introverted has autism. There are differential diagnoses. And that aspect, differential diagnosis, is a huge part, and it's something we struggle with here in Montana all the time, especially in our areas of lower population. So when we talk about things like what affects intervention, there are tons of things that affect these kids. So for a while there was a mom saying that she put her kid on a gluten-free, casein-free, sugar-free diet and her kid got better. No. A lot of kids have problems. Gluten is now this like fad, but this diet came out years ago before anybody knew what it was, and it cost $8 for a loaf of bread and things like that. I've worked with kids on those diets. They have better poop. Sorry, you guys have already eaten. But in special ed, we'll ask you. In special ed, we talk about poop probably at brunch time and after, about every day. So if your poop is better, aren't you learning better? You feel better, right? So we tend to see that, but there's no scientific correlation with diet. There's some interesting things coming out about the biomean and a possible connection, but it's really early science. So changing kids' diets can be helpful to provide better overall health and therefore make it easier to learn, but probably not correlated to outcomes for kids with autism in and of itself. All right, so what do we do instead? Well, we know that earlier is better. The most scientifically, I did so well today, rigorous form of treatment is called ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis. Local providers of that are places like Full Circle, Aware, Child Development Center, and some local individuals who have national certification called, BCBAs. Whoa, sorry, that was stuck. So for intervention, that's the most scientifically proven form, where we break things into small steps and provide intensive instruction over time. When I say intensive, young kids getting 40 hours a week of service. Okay, they also need speech and language services, often need OT, often need PT, occupational therapy and physical therapy. Okay, because kids with autism don't know where they are in time and space. They don't pay attention well because of this communication and imitation problem. And so they don't often pay attention. I think for kids with autism, we're like the Snoopy's, the Peanuts teacher, wah, 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 Lucy. Right? Because it's like, this doesn't make sense to me, does not compute, so I only pay attention when something's meaningful. Therefore, we use a lot of visual supports for these kids so that they're non-social, and when they're paying attention, they know what to do. We're also pretty good at telling kids what to do instead of what not to do. So instead of saying, don't run down the hallway, we're going to say, walk. Because what happens if we say, don't run, and the kid finally pays attention to the word run and then runs, what happens? They get in trouble for running, right? But in their world, they heard run, and they did run, and now they're in trouble. So what's that do to their relationship with you? Whereas if we say you're going to walk or use your walking feet or whatever expression you use, it doesn't matter when the kid pays attention, he's going to get the right direction. So really switching from not telling kids what not to do to telling kids what to do can be really helpful. Making it visual can be really helpful. Intensity is really helpful. So practice over time in a natural environment is helpful. Non-social instruction is helpful. I work with a girl who gave me this cold, who's a 9th grader, who only says a few words. She says no to everything you ask her to do, and then she does it anyway. We provide all our instruction in a written format. So if we're teaching her to do something, we use a highlighter to show the steps. She can add 4 and 5 digit numbers. She can read. If we're giving her a direction, we write it down, she reads it, she says no, and then she does it. We are going to work on taking the no out because it scares people. But she has no problem reading that, right? So we actually accommodate that so she can be functional. It's actually a really good job skill because she could take a list of written instructions and then carry them out, right? So, she did give me this cold though. I won't hold it against her. She's a ninth grader. What else can I tell you? So one of the things I would say is if a kid with autism comes to you for care, you want to first realize that they're going to be rigid in some way because they're not going to trust you. They're going to trust what they understand and can figure out for themselves in the environment. Okay? And it's not because you're not really good with kids. And in fact, sometimes being really good with kids works against you. Because how many of you guys, when you get kids, you're like, oh, I got kid skills. I can get at their level. I can make it super fun. They're going to love it. Guess what? You just hit all 3 strikes for kids with autism. So, for example, when I work with teachers, I say, you know, for a kid without autism who wants your attention but he needs to do math, you might say, do your math and when you're done, I'll come check it. Totally motivating because they want your attention. For a kid with autism, you tell them that, they're never doing their math. For a kid with autism, you say, I'm going to stand here while you do your math, and as soon as you're done, I'll leave you alone. Now they're doing their math as fast as they can. Okay? So we want to make the world make sense to them. So we limit a lot of that verbal. Don't want to be that Peanuts teacher. We tell them what to do. We show them through some kind of visual, whether that's the object itself, or a drawing of the object, or a word. We tell kids how long activities last. Kids with autism don't have a good sense of time. So think about if you didn't have a good sense of time, how that would affect your world. If you're having fun like you are now, you want it to last forever. So what happens when it ends? We have a tantrum. What happens if you have to do something you don't like? Well, you're not going to participate really well if you don't know when it ends. So if kids can see when it ends, that's motivating. So either we need to know when I do these 3 things, it's over, or when I hit this time, it's over. So we need a visual, some kind of visual schedule for all kids with autism. We need a safety plan because these kids tend to elope, not go to Las Vegas to get married, but run away from home. Half of the kids run away from home, and the #1 cause of death for kids with autism is drowning. And that does happen often during that elopement. So keeping them safe becomes important. Making sure they can communicate. All kids have a communication issue. Some kids are nonverbal. We have supports to help them communicate when they can't talk. Sign language, the picture exchange communication system, or mobile technology. Okay, they need social skills help, so planned practice. Sitting next to a kid who is typically developing isn't sufficient. All right, and a positive behavioral support approach to teaching kids to learn to behave. Kids with autism don't tend to misbehave because they don't understand the rule. They tend to misbehave because they don't understand the social and communication ramifications, right? So I'll tell you one more story and then we'll see who gets taco time. I work with a kid with autism, and he has some OCD behaviors, which is commonly associated with autism. So in his classroom, if the teacher's desk has a drawer that's open, he'll close it, or if the classroom door is open, he has to close it. It's just part of who he is. He likes to make sure everything's closed. So when he goes into the class with his typically developing kids, that gets him in trouble because he's out of his desk to shut the door, right? But if we accommodate that and know, okay, that's part of him, and use it to our benefit, it's good. So how do we use it to our benefit? He completes every single academic problem we give him. He's on target academically. So we know if we give him work and he knows what's expected of him because we put it in bins, it's called structured teaching, he'll do everything because he needs to complete. So it's a positive strength as well as a negative strength. So let's quickly go over all of this. Kids with autism struggle in the mainstream classroom. Well, it depends where they are on the spectrum and the supports we give them. Often putting them in by themselves isn't helpful, but some kids certainly do well, especially if we make accommodations. Like some of our kids are good in math, but they don't want to show their work. And that's like they fail. They get 80% on every test and zeros on every homework, so they get a D in the class. So if we can make some deals with the teachers and they can be flexible, it can be helpful. They don't grow up to be quote unquote normal. We know they have challenges with long-term outcomes. The diagnoses are all over the place, which is unfortunate. Social skills, including personal boundaries, are a challenge for these kids. Being too close, using their voice to show emotion, all challenging. The diagnosis for criteria has expanded. It's expanded and contracted and morphed. It's probably not the reason we have more kids, but it certainly is part of it. ASD, children with ADHD get misdiagnosed because of their behavior. I think that's the case in some places. 20% of counties in Montana have no kids getting special ed services, and I think it's because they'd rather be able to discipline for challenging behavior than treat autism, but that's not to leave this room. Sorry if you're being recorded. Don't do it. Does diet affect ASD? It's not a treatment that has verifiable outcomes, but certainly for some kids it makes a difference in how they feel and how they perform. Yes, social skills is one of the main criteria for diagnosis. I've never heard anything about black and whiteness. I think they can see the whole range of color, and they can't pretend. Pretending is based on imitation, so they have some problems with pretending. So if, for example, if I use this as a telephone, and then I try to pretend it's a hat, they'll say, no, it's a telephone. So just like a flower and a rose, that's my story with the kindergarten kids. So trouble pretending is certainly an issue. Yes, it looks different in girls than boys, but there's some commonalities. It is, we just talked about this. I like to think luckily, I picked a growth field all those 25 years ago when the only reference people knew was Rain Man. And there's more knowledge, like Comedy Central has fundraisers and stuff like that. But there is everybody thinks there is a general increase. Probably only 25% of the increase is real. 75% is diagnostically related or better diagnosis, things like that. It's the same prevalence in all high-resource countries. So Japan, Sweden, other what we would call first world or high-resource countries have the same incidence as us. I was in China talking about autism. They don't think they have any, but now they're worried they might. Right? It's probably the same thing with ADHD. They thought that was American disability, then they figured out they had it, now they're starting to have autism. So we don't see the same numbers in our under-resourced countries, but that's probably a diagnostic issue and not a real issue. And in China, hold on just a minute, and in China we know there's some civil rights violations. So before they could have more than one child, and they had a boy, it was a celebration, but when that boy wasn't developing so well, maybe that boy didn't survive. So lots of issues there. How do you know if a child has ASD? If they have any of those markers I just told you about, they might have ASD. I'm going to give you a resource right now that has all of the what I would call red flags all listed. So it's called, just Google, Learn the Signs, Act Early. It's through the CDC, National CDC, and they have autism and other developmental disabilities. I am your CDC ambassador, so if you have questions, let me know. There's also the Montana Autism Center, and if you Google that, you can get free resources from either spot. So those are two reputable resources if you think a kid has autism and you want to know. Local resources are the centers, are the Child Development Center, Full Circle, things like that. Your school district, they all have teams to diagnose kids. Vaccines we talked about. Do they have a higher level of anxiety? Yes, we talked about a big percentage having actual diagnosable social anxiety. And are they born with it? Well, that's the indication right now. We can't say that for certain. So that was about 55 minutes of a semester of autism. So thank you for your time and attention, and I think we're going to do some raffles.